Welcome to CleanStart Perspectives, CleanStart's regular discussion on everything in entrepreneurship and the energy transition. In a minute, you're going to hear from us. But first, I want to take some time to encourage you to like and subscribe, so that way you can stay up to date with the content that we produce and the information that's out there. Also, I'd like to thank our sponsors, SMUD, River City Bank, Blue Tech Valley, and the California Mobility Center. I encourage you to check them out and find out how they're helping Sacramento become a clean tech hub and delivering on the energy transition. This is CleanStart's Perspectives. I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of CleanStart, and today I welcome Mark Hockridge, Chief Innovation Officer of CRE Intelligent. Is that how you, or do you pronounce it all as one?
Well, it's Creintelligence.
Creintelligence. Now, Mark is a habitual entrepreneur that has built companies and teams in those companies that have been successful, and you've learned a lot probably through those ways that don't work and do work. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask you to kind of give, I guess, a longer background of yourself on teams.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So my background, as Thomas mentioned, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been involved in 8 startups, either in kind of founder, CEO, or COO capacity, primarily within technology firms, a lot of software as a service, platform as a service, or technology-enabled services businesses. And most of those have been venture-backed businesses. So I have a lot of experience in the fundraising process and all that goes along with having investors on the board and being in a growth-oriented startup. Most recently here with Creintelligent, which is a commercial real estate platform for due diligence around commercial real estate transactions and folks that have portfolios of commercial properties.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of brought you in kind of to talk about teams. And one of the reasons that we find that it's really important is you're an entrepreneur, you have an idea. And the first thing a lot of them think is like, well, I need money so I can do my idea. And a lot of that kind of forgets that, it's going to take more than yourself to do it. So when someone, if someone has an idea and, they want to look to building a team, what are kind of some first, personal steps you think that they might need to take to figure that out or to develop the team?
Yeah, I think that's a common problem or a common scenario is, as you'd mentioned, you get to a point where you realize, okay, I can't now do it all myself. I need another set of hands, or I need more brain power, or fill in the gaps of skills and experience. And so I think, sometimes you see founders just kind of rush to start filling roles because they know that there's a certain number of roles or certain types of roles to fill out maybe a leadership team or what have you. And often that leads to downstream challenges, not necessarily problems, but challenges. I think to your question, to do it well and to do it right is to step back and get a lot of clarity around what your vision is and what your near-term or long-term needs are, so that you have a bit of a roadmap to understand at what point am I going to need certain types of skills and team members. I think, by trend, there's, especially like within venture studios and things like that, there's an inclination to go ahead and kind of partner folks up. I mean, maybe have a strong engineering founder, and so you need somebody maybe that has a stronger evangelism and selling capabilities to complement that person. And that does seem to be a winning combination where you can find people that complement one another as kind of the initial team. And then beyond that, I think it really comes down to the individual needs of that business at that time. When are you going to be ready to start developing product or to release product, and when are you going to start selling and supporting? And so that cadence or those milestones then dictate and kind of who you need and when. Okay.
So kind of there was, having that kind of communication, the vision and goals and tracking of the business. What are some, ways to communicate clear goals and expectations to build a team?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll back it up even a step further, which is, before communicating the goals, I think it's really important to clarify your vision. All right, so I found that once people have a shared vision and have a shared culture that is adhered to and taken seriously, the rest starts to just kind of happen. You build momentum, and gravity's working for you. But once you have that clarity of vision, it's important to constantly re-articulate that and share that with the employees that you have or partners that you have, so that people then just understand what the future state is going to look like and can work towards that. And then you can empower people and give people more latitude if they are bought into that common vision. But from a goal perspective, down at the goal level, I think it's really important to get granular with those goals and do it with the help of the team, right? So that everybody has their fingerprints on it and feels bought into what those goals are. I like to follow kind of that SMART methodology for goals, which is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound, as a construct to develop a goal that everybody understands really clearly and can work against. And then it's just a matter of establishing kind of this cadence of accountability where you're re-engaging with those people that have responsibility for a goal or tasks within a goal. And I think you can, select a cadence that works best for you. I, like to have pretty frequent conversations with those folks in my teams that are handling a goal or managing a goal, so that we stay on track and we can follow the milestones along the way.
You had mentioned, fundraising and working with funders on it. Now, often, it seems like I see, entrepreneurs that have, potentially different goals than their investors. Maybe they have bigger, grander goals or longer term goals or whatever their differences are. How important, or how would you recommend, an entrepreneur kind of addressing their goals versus investor's goals who might not be perfectly aligned? They both want to be successful, but they might not be perfectly aligned. How have you handled that in the past, or how would you recommend someone handling it?
I think on the front end, I mean, it's usually less likely to have misalignment of goals early on, right? Because somebody's going through the diligence process and listening to your pitch and your vision for the company. And so up front, there tends to be pretty good alignment. In my experience, where you start to see some divergence in that is down the road, and where maybe an investor has a time horizon for their investment, or maybe the risk tolerance is greater, and so they're encouraging the founders or the leadership team to take more risks or less risks, and so I think the key there is open communication and just understanding where everybody sits in that. And because the reality is, especially on the investor side, and especially in early stages where you're taking angel money and maybe some venture capital money and quite frankly, a lot of friends and family money. And so everybody has a different investment horizon, different expectations for the return or maybe the liquidity around that. And so, inherently there is going to be some not necessarily conflict, but certainly differences of expectation. And so I think that it's just best to communicate often about where the company is and what that vision is, and continue to get people either bought in or at least understanding what that is. And then when, downstream, as I mentioned, as challenges arise, you just have to deal with those as they come up. And it really depends on which investor you're talking about, right? You're not necessarily making changes for their friends and family, but you may need to pivot for your primary VC.
The big bags of money. How does company culture play into all this?
I think I found, and this is one of my big learnings professionally over the years, was it's one thing to have a great team or great individuals that comprise the team, when you get culture right, there's no right, but when you get the right fit of culture and everybody is on board, and working within those cultural constraints and value constraints, then it just feels like everything goes so much smoother. I mean, it's like a force multiplier when it's working well. The other thing I found is that, maybe earlier on in businesses, or sometimes when you acquire a business and you bring in new people, that has an effect on culture. It changes it, right? Because you just have new people and different perspectives. And when the culture is really strong, the organization starts to morph and self-police itself. So as an example, employees are more thoughtful when going through the interview process because they're thinking about the cultural norms of the business and what the needs are. Similarly, individuals can sense if they no longer fit within that culture and often will self-select out. And so, when that occurs, when you get to that point where the culture is so strong that people are self-selecting and that people are very thoughtful about who comes into the business and how we act, it's just like a big momentum flywheel effect that's super positive.
Now there's now what about some of the potential warning signs of also things like that? Because we've seen it at some companies where the culture then becomes more of a toxic one. So what are some ways that a founder can make sure that they have a good diversity of thought and that they don't have that they don't end up building a culture that could result in very negative externalities later on?
Yeah, that was a great question. I think there's two things in there that just resonated with me. One is that I think it's important that as a founder or leader, when you're establishing culture, you're not thinking about it just from your own individual perspective. You're also not doing it completely aspirationally. In other words, like if you sit down and write up a set of core values or principles, and you're not really living those, you're setting the stage for problems because you're not going to match up to it. People, then all the employees are somewhat confused because your actions and behaviors aren't in alignment with what those stated cultural elements are. So that was one piece. And the other is, you're right. I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind is it was so common, especially within tech companies, that you get this sort of a very homogenous bro culture, where everybody's the same caricature and thinking the same way. And so while diversity and inclusion are, meaningful topics right now, I think it's super important, not just, for proper representation, but to have people that think differently. I think you have to share the same core values that the company establishes, whatever those are for you. But you want people that challenge the thinking and that speak up and that represent different constituencies. And those are the things that lead to innovation and greater productivity. And quite frankly, just greater satisfaction for everybody. It's a more harmonious place to work than, just a bunch of people that have groupthink.
Mm-hmm. Groupthink isn't, it's a dangerous thing. On that kind of thing, as you have a company that's growing and scaling, you're trying to make sure that you have the diversity of thought, the diversity of culture to build a strong culture that can get going on it. What happens when, at a certain point, there's parts of a company where you're like, okay, I think I'm going to outsource this, or I'm going to use vendors to address this sort of thing, whether it's sometimes, like in hardware, it might be some of the development and manufacturing, it might be HR and payroll, so that, these outside groups don't, do they have to share the culture exactly of your company? And how does your, getting into that rolling ball of just becoming a high efficient team play in with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, and this is something that all small startup companies at different phases face, which is, if I'm going to outsource, what do I outsource, right? I mean, do I take things that are central to the business and outsource those? And that comes with a lot of risk. And so I think generally or traditionally, companies will outsource capabilities that aren't central or aren't to the core of their value proposition and who they are. So you can very easily early on outsource things, like finance or and maybe to some degree development, so long as you have some internal champions and drivers over that. But the cultural piece of that, or kind of how you build those teams, how you select those groups, can be challenging. I don't know that they have to necessarily share the same exact culture, but there has to be some alignment there, especially if you consider your outsourced providers as an augmented team. So to the degree that your internal team is directly working with those outsourced providers in a collaborative capacity, then I think that alignment does need to be closer or tighter. If you can look at the function as really siloed, then maybe it doesn't matter as much. But in my experience, we in development in particular, I've had situations that have worked very harmoniously, and the team has just been kind of an extension of the internal team. I've also had some experiences where we outsourced to groups that operated in different ways. They communicated differently. Their commitment level was different, and those were challenging things to go through because we ultimately, I think, went slower than we could have, and the work product was not nearly what we wanted internally. So, I mean, those were hard lessons, but I think you just need to think about how central the item is that you're trying to achieve or that function. And again, whether it's going to be an augmented team or a full kind of siloed outsource.
Now, earlier you had mentioned something about, all-stars. And I think, and a lot of people, they go and they say like, I want, that top 1% for every job in my company. And I'm honestly reminded of the early 2000 Blazers that got Scottie Pippen along with a couple other all-stars that just fell absolutely flat.
Right.
And there's music groups and all sorts of things where like, we're going to make a super group, and it becomes, too many cooks, not enough other positions.
Yeah.
So when it comes to kind of building, I guess you have your goals and you have your expectations. All-stars and expectations, how do you kind of balance what is too many all-stars, and how do we make sure we get those expectations done?
That's a great question. I love the anecdote there. I think about like the Terrell Owens, right, where you have an awesome player, but they're somewhat toxic. And just as a quick aside, I mean, I made a fairly significant error in one of my early startups. We got to a point where we had product market fit, and we were approaching the kind of the scale problem. And so we brought in an individual into the team who came from a professional athletic background, which, by the way, I tend to really like. I mean, I like people that not necessarily just athletics, but folks that have been in a really competitive environment where they've had to fully commit. I mean, I like those kinds of individuals generally. In this case, not only came from that athletic background, but also was an all-star in his area of expertise. Early on, and I think kind of in the short run, you can make that work. You can find results from that. In this case, this was a Terrell Owens type. I mean, he brought a bunch of toxicity with him, and as it turned out, was applying quite a bit of a heavy hand, and in some case, kind of a pseudo abusive or harassment culture in the company or within his department. And I didn't realize it at first. I mean, we watched him. We were just even the rest of the leadership team, we were so enamored with how good this individual was and the energy and the passion and commitment that they brought. We, I think, overlooked for a little while the toxicity of it. And ultimately, had to pull the plug on that because I became aware of some of this heavy-handedness and it was not in alignment with the culture that we had in that business. And so there wasn't a place for it. But yeah, it's easy to get lulled in because somebody is a rock star, but it has to be right for the business. It's got to be a right cultural fit. And I'll tell you from that experience, I probably spend more time in the recruiting process or interview process trying to consider the person in cultural terms as I do about their skills and experience. Not to say that, I mean, skills and experience, that's the ante to the game, right? You got to have the goods in order to fill a key role. But boy, if they're out of alignment, it can be disastrous.
I think that's incredibly salient. And I was thinking, you're saying, they had the commitment and passion, but you got to put those together and also have the compassion, for kind of yes. around you on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, a lot of, when we talk, everyone's like, I want to build this team. And one of the things that, it's kind of from that bro culture that you had mentioned that slips in there. It's, I want to get people that I can go and have a beer with. And one of the guy, Dennis Wingate, who we had talked in the past, when I asked him about, how he felt about the people on his really high performing business, and he said, well, I would never get a single beer with any of them. And we've heard stories about, the investor that he liked to take the companies up to Tahoe and have a drink in a hot tub. And then someone, a pregnant woman said, I'm a startup and I can't get in a hot tub and I can't have beers.
Right.
So how do we kind of balance, I guess, that it's the work-life balance and finding someone that, you can work with, but often we say like, okay, we also want to be best friends with, but that can have some drawbacks too. How do we balance, I guess that work kind of play thing that we try to push together without making it exclusionary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, when all possible, I try to avoid a hot tub scenario.
True, very true. Don't.
I think I've done both. I like working with friends, so long as there's an understanding that we have our professional lives, we have our personal lives, and you can really distinguish the two. There is something. There's a nice chemistry that occurs when people are friendly with one another. It doesn't mean that they have to go have beers. In fact, I tend not to fall into that camp. I'm not big in necessarily socializing outside of the office. I like doing team building and I like interacting with people and I love sharing our experiences. But I find blending the two at the office and outside of the office, it just makes it more challenging. But to create that, that chemistry or create that tight collaboration, I think it's really comes down to having respect for those individuals and treating each other, valuing, their thoughts and the work product and even in really valuing the role that they serve, right? So if you have that mutual respect and each person is empowered to go perform, go be awesome, then things work really well. And that can be achieved just in the office. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're going to have beers or jumping into a hot tub.
Okay. What are some of the difficult roles to fill in a startup?
There's two that jump to mind. I think, if generally the founder of a business takes the CEO role, and I just saw a study, that said that those founders that become CEOs remain the CEO for a long time. A venture capitalist or other investors do not want to pull the plug on that. They might diminish the roles and responsibilities and put some other folks around that person, but they like to let that CEO run. So that means then that the second in command, the COO role, if you will, becomes a really vital hire, not just because the CEO needs help, but those two roles need to mesh with one another. They need to fill in the weaknesses of the other, complement the strengths. And so I believe that now there's certain COO roles that you requires a bunch of industry expertise as well. Like you're not going to take a tech software COO and drop them in a manufacturing plant COO role, that person's going to flail. But skills and experience aside, that the meshing of those, the CEO and COO, are really critical. And if it's not right, it can set you back for a long, long time. So I think that's a very tough one to hire for, because you have to be very thoughtful. The second, at least in startup world, to me, I'll call it VP of sales, but whatever, CRO, VP sales, director of sales, whatever level you want to call it. That can be a tough one, because early on you need an individual contributor as much as you need a team builder and long-term manager or leader of that department. And that can be tough, because oftentimes the best salesperson is not a great sales leader. Also, you look towards that first salesperson not only to be an individual contributor, but you're looking to them to be the person that brings in other talent around sales as necessary and as needed. And so the person's not only have to have great skills and leadership capability, but they've got to have a follower-ship of people in sales that want to come work for that person. And so that one can be tricky, because in a startup, especially, that your arc of growth requires different things around that sales leader at different times. And it can be a tricky one. And oftentimes I think the person that comes in initially into that role isn't the person that can serve the role long-term. So I think that one's also a tough one.
I kind of want to get some more information kind of on that, because, we meet a lot of technical founders. And then, you get your kind of some business development that's more focused on fundraising than sales, potentially, that comes in and pairs with them sometimes. But sales is, it's customer education, it's marketing, it's all the stuff that brings the money in the door. And it is often really foreign to a lot of technical founders. So what are some pitfalls to avoid, or how can they learn more about making a better selection on their sales personnel or sales team?
I think especially for investor-backed startups, I think the thing I would recommend is to utilize that network of professionals to help you in this process, especially if you're an engineering founder. Not only do you maybe not the best at recruiting, right? You're good at your core competency, but beyond the recruitment piece, you also haven't been in sales. You haven't experienced that as much. And so it can be really foreign and a tough concept to get your head around. I think, oftentimes as a leader, managing the sales or go-to-market function in the business can be challenging, because it's a very distinct type of individual that is a salesperson and sales leadership. The same goes for technical teams, right? So if I think about development teams, they're often really challenging, at least for myself, to manage, because they're just different types of people. And so if you're an engineering founder or a technical founder, they can just not be very understandable how to approach going after salespeople. So, especially at the VC level, usually they have plenty of resources and plenty of experience to help you navigate the recruitment and selection process. And they can help you define and refine the job description, the expectations around those roles, and maybe also even how to approach managing those roles. So that would be an area that I would highly recommend, seeking help.
So if you're, founders out there that are looking for money, don't just take any money. Make sure you take money of people who can also potentially provide other support that you might not have. That should be a big takeaway from there too.
100%. I mean, it's always easier said than done, right? I mean, when you're running out of money and you're trying to keep the entity alive, I mean, every check feels like a good check. I think you're right. To the degree you can align with people that bring strategic value or that kind of coaching or mentoring capability, fantastic. Not always your option.
Yeah. And one thing I kind of also throw out there in sales that I know from my personal experience, um, make sure your salesperson isn't over promising. Um, if it's, especially if it's your first sale.
Yeah.
So, we've talked a lot about different jobs, and I at one point at one of the places that I first started at years ago, they gave me the title of CFO, which I hated because I was not qualified to be a CFO.
Yeah.
But job titles are a really kind of interesting thing in building a team. I know HP in India discovered that they actually preferred regularly changing job titles to indicate that they were moving up. And here it's also job titles signal other things. So when you're trying to figure this out, is there a strategic importance, or what do you need to consider when you're creating these job titles for people?
Yeah, I think there is some importance there. In a startup, oftentimes we're trying to, for fundraising purposes, you're trying to show a leadership team, a strong bench, and so you want to have the CFO or a COO or a CTO, and so you want these titles. But at the same time, if you do a lot of title inflation and put these weighty titles like they did with CFO on you, that it only sets. I mean, it serves a purpose outwardly to my clients, partners, investors, that you're that person that is responsible for these certain functions, and that's positive. But the downside is that as the company evolves, you're as an individual, you're all of a sudden out of your element, and you're unable to really perform at that level of the job title. And so the company then probably has to go get another CFO, a real CFO. Mm-hmm. And so now there's an awkward conversation, or that could be detrimental to you. I don't, to deflate that person or to make them feel unimportant or failing. And so I think you got to straddle the two, right? I mean, I think you want to be thoughtful about the titles you give out, need to think in the long term. And I think the other thing too is you can have the concept of internal title and external title, right? And sometimes you want to portray, again, that we have these certain core capacities in a CFO and a COO in place, but internally, you might have real titles and that are more aligned to responsibility.
If you ever find yourself in the situation that I was, my recommendation is what I did is outsource yourself. And make sure everyone knows. Yeah. So kind of on that, I know Gary's here. I know he was having some camera issues. Gary, did you want to chime in with some questions?
Yeah, try the camera again. I know it keeps strobing, but see if we can start it. But Mark, very good stuff here. Very common issue on the CFO. Lots of small companies, they get a lot of money, they've got to manage it, and they now have investors that expect audited financials. They have to figure out how they deal with cash flow and getting loans from banks to back themselves up. These are all jobs that most founders don't want to have. And so they're looking for a CFO. Yet the tension between a CEO and a CFO is one of the most important things I've seen in a company. The CFO job, by its nature, has to be somewhat of a naysayer. Why are we spending this money? Why don't we do that? We've made this commitment. Why aren't we meeting it? And the CEO is more of the, push ahead, business development, let's take on the next risk. That tension is really important, and they have to respect each other. Therefore, it's one of the hardest jobs to fill. Yep. And I've dealt with a number of people where, the CFO sort of felt entitled to move into the chair of CEO at some point. But when you think about it in a startup, no, that's like putting the wrong guy behind the wheel, because he's got a background in sort of being cautious, and in a startup, that's not what you want. So I find that job hard to find the right person for, and especially one that sees his career as, doing the best job possible at CFO, maybe getting good people around him, and then maybe his career path is leave the company and go to a bigger one if he wants a bigger role and a bigger salary. What's your experience been in finding a good CFO?
Yeah, I think there's a great point that you bring up, and I've had a number of experiences in this regard. I think a lot of it depends upon the company itself, right? So, as an example, Cretelligent, we've got a great CFO in place, and as a company, we need that role because we do acquisitions and we do a bunch of different, financing mechanisms, and there's just a lot at play that requires strategic financial decision making, and we're also dealing, with entities that have higher expectations and requirements around that. But there's other organizations. I've worked for fairly large SaaS organizations where you can get away with a controller or even an accounting level person, and then use a fractional CFO for strategic work or to help, to your point, establish maybe lines of credit or other mechanisms and use those in a fractional sense. But yes, if you're going to need a full-fledged CFO, that can be a tricky hire, especially for a startup that is going to be very nimble, is going to be very frequently challenged with their cash reserves and runway, and thrust against the pressures that exist from the CEO who's visionary and wanting to hit the throttle, and quite frankly, the investors behind that person that are also looking for you to swing for the fences. And so, yeah, there is a natural tension there. But I think, first and foremost, I think you got to really look at your needs, and not your accounting needs, but your strategic financial decision making and how much of that you really require.
There's a part that Gary had mentioned and you had mentioned on there that I kind of hope we can expand on, because I feel like we had completely glossed over it at the beginning, is conflict of ideas. We highlighted that groupthink is terrible, but how do you handle conflict of ideas, and I guess resolving them and then kind of going forward? At the leadership, that's critical, but it's also a hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think. Well, I can tell you just for myself, and I don't have the market cornered on this by any stretch, but I tend to be very collaborative, and so I seek that out, and I appreciate conflicting ideas. I have my own risk tolerances. I have my own thoughts about how to go about things, and those aren't necessarily right. In fact, it's a large percentage where it's not right, or there's maybe better thinking. And so, setting up your team so that there is certainly collaboration and open communication and respect for these ideas, but also this kind of concept of healthy tension or healthy friction. My friend and investor, Roger Akers, he used to talk to me a lot about this, and we would say, how do we make sure that as we're hiring people in, or how do we create that organizational tension for the sake of challenging ideas, but tension for the sake of pushing for growth. And I think all of that is necessary.
Well, let me change the topic to another thing that a lot of the growing startups have, and that is, the CEO is usually the guy with the product division, and is the hard charger, has spent the time making the pitch deck and convincing investors to bring the money in. And then all of a sudden the money comes in. And you've made a lot of promises in those pitch decks, and you realize, I don't have the arms and legs necessary to get all this done. We're sort of confronted by the failure of success. How do I find people quickly? Now, been in that situation. Interviews to me have very limited usefulness, because there's a strong bias, that, they're telling you things you want to hear, that you're not asking good questions. So I have sort of adopted the strategy of, somebody comes close, hire them and see how they do. Give them a 90-day probationary period. And if it isn't fitting, move on. But if you have to hire 5 or 6 people real quick to meet contract deadlines or investor expectations, it's not easy to let people go.
No, it's not. That's real, Gary. I mean, it's like when you're faced with that, and the other thing too is, your investors at that point, they've now made a commitment, they wrote a check, right? Or you just closed a round. The expectation is that you start utilizing that capital in efficient ways. And so there's like this overarching expectation, or sometimes even a request demand that's like, go get these people, get them fast. And that's somewhat counterproductive, because to your point, I mean, it's not only time consuming, but super costly to make the error, right? To bring somebody in, even have them go through the 90-day probation. And then of course, if you've got the intestinal fortitude to cut them off at 90 days, which most folks, hire or fire way too slowly, then you got to go through the recruitment process again. And it's not necessarily just the hard costs of losing and making that hire, spending your time on onboarding only to have them leave, but the opportunity cost can be huge, right? Everybody says, hire slow, fire fast. Both are easier said than done. I think, one of my career lessons, looking back, is, at the point at which I decide that, okay, I can't go any longer with an individual, I need to, change people out. It's often much later than it should have been, right? Because you want to help develop the person. You made this hire, you've emotionally invested in the individual, and you want to help them be successful. And it may not be their fault at all. If I didn't have clear objectives and understanding of what the outcomes of that individual needed to be, if I didn't have that up front, then very likely I'm going to make a poor hire, and then we're going to be making a change downstream. So I think again, kind of lessons learned. I like the idea of being very, very tight on developing my roles or my job descriptions and the expected outcomes of that position, so that I can determine in the interview process, what do I believe the likelihood of this person succeeding against those outcomes in the time frame that I've established to be. And if it's not super high, then I'm best to keep searching. So I think being very thoughtful up front as the hiring manager or the leader is super critical. And then, establishing a really strong 30, 60, 90 expectations, and so that it becomes less of an emotional decision at the end of that trial period, if you will, as to whether or not there's a fit or not. Certainly don't want to let that languish and turn into 6 months, right?
Well, but it also seems to say that, if you're planning for success, don't wait until you have the money to start looking.
Yeah, you absolutely
be in your back pocket.
Absolutely. I think that's going back to the kind of the CEO role. I mean, one of the things I believe that in addition to fundraising and vision and evangelism, and you constantly recruiting, not necessarily hiring, but you're constantly recruiting and networking and telling your story and getting people emotionally invested in the business, so that you have a pool of good candidates when the time comes.
Yeah, it's tricky.
It's very tricky.
And it's sort of a conscious allocation of your own time and looking ahead to what you're going to need. But last question I'll ask is, in the businesses I've had and those with over 100 employees, one of my best sources of new employees was recommendations from the people I already have.
Absolutely.
Who've seen people in other companies that they liked and did well. And the success rate of that was pretty high. Now there's issues of, if you're getting family and friends coming in, you have to be careful on that. But I mean, if it's an unrelated individual, and this person that I already have hired says, I worked with this guy over here and he was really good. Yeah, I've made that a top priority.
Yeah,
because that's a strong indication of reality. Somebody knows how this person actually performs in the job.
absolutely. And I think that's the best additions to the team that I've had historically have come from the same source, right? From employee referrals. Now, circling this all the way back, to what we were talking about vision and culture. When you have really strong culture, and strong vision for the company, those people that are referring individually, they tend not to do kind of the, friends, family suggestions, because they're thought into what is the company trying to achieve and what are the guidelines that we operate by. And so they don't tend to bring in folks that don't fit that mold. Yeah, I think it's super, super valuable to try to tap into your existing employees as a source for new talent.
Yeah. Well, been a very interesting discussion. Thomas, we've run over a little bit here, but
yeah, I want to ask him one more question. So if I'm an entrepreneur, I have this idea for a business and I have no idea where to start building a team. What is one of the first steps that you recommend they take to going and starting building that team?
Back to vision. Like, what am I going to achieve? Have a plan, right? So what do I need at different stages of growth? What do I need most immediately? And be very, very detailed about how you define that, right? So think about what your needs are, not just now, but a little bit in the future as well. And put pen to paper and really, really write out all the different attributes and skills and experience that are required.
And then come to CleanStart and we'll try to help tear it down and connect you with the right people.
Fantastic.
All right. I want to thank Mark for joining us today. Round of applause. Thank you. I learned a lot. It's a good perspective, especially, on, so how you can live and die by a team. Additional thank you to our sponsors, our general sponsors, and our sponsors for this SMUD, the CMC, Blue Tech Valley, River City Bank. Make sure to join us virtually on the 23rd and in person at the CMC to talk about charging. Thank you all for attending, and those out there watching. I know I can see you on my feed. Connect with us on LinkedIn, follow us on YouTube, and check out Empower Innovation, that the CEC's social networking site. And thank you all for attending. And that's all sheer out.